Welcome to the Midlife Mavericks podcast, where we empower men in their prime to redefine what it means to thrive beyond 40. Join us as we navigate the complexities of midlife, offering insights, strategies, and inspiration to reclaim your health, vitality, and purpose. From personal stories of transformation to expert interviews and actionable tips, each episode is designed to support you on your journey to live the best life in your midlife and beyond. Get ready to unleash your inner maverick and embrace the adventure of aging with grace, strength, and purpose. Are you battling bloating, constipation, or other digestive woes? Well, you're not alone. In this episode of the Midlife Mavericks podcast, we delve into the world of gut health and a little-known condition called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. Our guest, Dr. Nirala Jacobi, is a leading naturopathic doctor and the mastermind behind the SIBO biphasic diet. She'll explain what SIBO is and how it can wreak havoc on your digestion, the different types of SIBO and how they're diagnosed, effective treatment options, including the biphasic diet and addressing underlying causes, and how to support your gut health and finally conquer those digestive struggles. This episode is a must listen for anyone experiencing gut issues or wanting to optimize their digestion for overall health. Tune in and take control of your gut health today. Dr. Nirala Jacobi, welcome to the Midlife Mavericks podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
I'm excited, mate. I can't wait to dive into your specialist topic and learn a lot more, hopefully, about gut health and about SIBO. But before we do kick into that, if you and I were to board an airplane, where would that airplane be heading? Do you have a favorite holiday destination or something on your bucket list?
Wow. Okay. So I would probably would want to go to Palau, east of the Philippines. You know, I've been looking at that for diving and stuff. So that's been it's either there or we're going to Scotland.
I'll come with you to the Philippines because I'd love to go there and see the diving as well.
Yeah.
I've lived in the UK for 10 years and I'm not sure going there. I'm over the cold winters there. So
yeah, understood.
Yeah, I'll join you on the flight to Philippines. If we were sitting next to each other on the plane and having a conversation and I was to ask you more about, your purpose and passion, what would you say that is right now?
Well, right now I'm on a sabbatical, so my passion and purpose is shape-shifting a little bit. But for the last over 25 years, I've been a naturopathic doctor, trained in the US. And in the US, we're trained like GPs. And I was a primary care physician in Montana. And then I came here about 20 years ago now. It was a real focus on digestive disorders, functional digestive disorders. And there is such a joy when you really deep dive into something that you're excited about. And it's a huge emerging field, as we know, the whole science of microbiome, assessment is all evolving as we speak. So it's always a fresh topic.
Yeah, 100%. I think we've learned so much, just in the last decade about gut health and
for sure.
It's just evolving all the time, isn't it? It's incredible. I'm curious, like naturopathy, what got you into that? Like, is there a story behind what led you that way and maybe what led you into gut health?
Yeah. So, yes, I have had my own gut issues, but unlike many others who had some illness that they overcame and then took up the profession, it was really sort of happenstance back in the early 90s where I was still, you're in your 20s and you don't know what you're doing. And I was taking a lot of classes in a community college, and one of them was nutrition. And that sort of really piqued my interest. And she said, the teacher said, we have a specialty college just around the corner. And it turns out that I was working for Greenpeace at the time. They had their office in the basement of that very college. I had no idea. And once I investigated, so it's like life led me there. And then once I really looked into it, it was like dream come true, exactly what I wanted to do. Yeah.
Awesome. Great opportunity, right place, right time by the sounds of things.
Yes, yes, and that's kind of how I've lived my life in many ways. It was just like, well, that's happening now. Let's focus the energy there and let's see what wants to happen. And so, what happened was in 2011, I was basically a primary care physician, then came here to Australia, and I had never really heard about SIBO, right? And I was a specialist already, sort of in IBS and other functional digestive disorders. And then I really did. Nobody knew about SIBO at the time. We certainly had never heard about it in med school. And then I had this opportunity to take a lecture from a colleague in America, and she talked about SIBO, and I was just completely floored because it explained so much why some of my IBS patients that normally respond really well to my treatments weren't improving. And so that's how that whole journey began back in 2011. And since then, I've built sort of like this whole sort of SIBO empire around this topic. And really, my passion is educating practitioners and really getting very good results with their gut patients. So that's been my focus over the last 13, 14 years now.
Yeah, incredible. What a journey it's been. And actually, a couple of colleagues I work with in the functional medicine space both recommended getting you on the podcast because they've both either worked with you or heard of you or had some sort of contact some way with all the stuff that you're doing. And it's incredible to see, that all that information you're sharing and spreading and it's growing. So you mentioned there that you didn't really know about SIBO, and I still think there's a lot of people in society that just know nothing about SIBO. Like commonly, if you go to the doctor with certain gut issues and gut complications, they might do a few little tests on you, but they diagnose us with IBS or IBD or something along those lines. Like how aware do you think people are of different gut disorders in our society today?
Well, there's a couple things that we need to unpack first about this whole idea of IBS, because even to this day, people are, as you mentioned, go to the doctor and are told they have IBS because the doctor can't figure out what it is and just eat more fiber and learn to live with it, which is arguably really bad advice because about 60 to 80%, depending on what research you read, of IBS is actually SIBO. So if you have listeners right now that have been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, which is basically just a combination of symptoms, it's not a disease, it's just a combination of symptoms that are there for various reasons, but are basically managed, just the symptoms are managed through your GP, sometimes not even that. But if you go to somebody that is more of a gut specialist, they will investigate what the cause is that's specific for your IBS. SIBO is top of the list for me in terms of IBS. And then there are lots of other reasons why people do have IBS. So that's IBS. And about 11% of the world has a diagnosis of IBS. So that's a huge percentage, right, of people that have been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome. Now, what's happened over the last 10 years even is this huge explosion of quote unquote gut health on social media. So there is all of this, which has been both great in terms of bringing in the light and bringing in, sort of explanations for people as to what's going on with their symptoms that they weren't getting from their GP. So that's been really good. But unfortunately, as is the case with social media, there's also a lot of misinformation. So it is both beneficial and sort of detrimental for somebody to only search social media for what's going on with their digestive tract.
Yeah, 100%, mate. It's one of those slippery slopes, isn't it? A lot of great information, but also a lot of conflicting information to try sort through.
Oh, yeah.
Not everything works for everybody, which we're going to obviously talk about a little bit more. Can we talk a little bit more about symptoms? Like what sort of symptoms are patients experiencing that could point them in the direction of SIBO?
Number one symptom that I typically hear is bloating, right? Almost not can be directly after meals, but within the first 20 minutes after eating or so, that people just feel really, really bloated. And there's reasons for that. I can get into that a little later. But then, you have classic irritable bowel syndrome, bowel patterns as well. You can have diarrhea, you can have constipation, you can have a mixed pattern, you can have reflux, you can have abdominal pain, you can have those types of classic symptoms that would lead a GP to consider irritable bowel syndrome if everything is clear on a colonoscopy or endoscopy, those types of things.
Yeah, 100%. So if we've got those symptoms, like what would be a good way for us to sort of help us diagnose if that's SIBO or if it's something else that's causing those problems? Are there, I suppose, reliable tests that we can use to diagnose SIBO?
Yeah, and this is I do own a breath testing company, so I'll say that there's obviously a bit of a bias here, but I've done this now for a long time, and I think that's probably the easiest, least expensive way to rule out whether or not you have a condition like that. And that is SIBOtest.com. You can order a test kit yourself. It's always preferred to go through a practitioner so that you have some guidelines as to what to do next if you're positive. And test positive for SIBO. The idea here is that if you like what SIBO really is basically it stands for small intestine bacterial overgrowth, which, as the name implies, is a tremendous overgrowth of bacteria that are not meant to be there, right? Your digestive tract from mouth to anus has very different concentrations of microbiome and microbial colonies that live in these different areas. The small intestine, which is right after the stomach and it goes all the way to your large intestine, is meant to be, if you think of ecosystem, more like a desert, right, in terms of bacterial overgrowth, whereas it's a jungle down in the colon. That's where your microbiome is meant to be, where we get all of our health benefits, our short-chain fatty acids and all of that. But the small intestine, the surface area is really reserved for breaking down food and absorption of nutrients. And if you have bacteria there that are feeding on the food that you're eating and fermenting it, causing these gases to build up, then you're running into not just issues around symptoms, but true sort of underlying factors also, like nutritional deficiencies and inflammation and leaky gut and food sensitivities and histamine problems. And it kind of goes on. And there are real reasons why people develop SIBO. It's not just about, well, it's bacteria, let's just take antimicrobials, and we'll get over it. Because to me, that's sort of a lazy way of thinking about it. Sometimes that does work, but for the most part, you need to get to the underlying cause of what caused SIBO for you to really be eradicating it for good.
Yeah, 100%. I'm glad you clarified that. That's probably a question I should have asked at the start was, can you define what SIBO is? And it is that small intestine bacterial overgrowth that you're talking about. You just mentioned cause there. Do we know what causes SIBO?
Yes. So there are different categories in the case of food poisoning before. So let's say your listeners, you went to Bali or you went to a local salad bar or, however you got food poisoning. And food poisoning is caused by pathogenic bacteria that are very different from SIBO bacteria. It's a different thing. So bacteria that cause food poisoning, like E. coli, like Campylobacter, like Salmonella, all have in common that they secrete this very specific poison called CDTB. And this poison is detected by your body, and your body actually makes an antibody to this, right? So this is a normal immune response to these bacteria. But the problem here is, and what's been discovered is that when the body produces these antibodies to CDTB, it often makes, it sort of triggers this autoimmune response. And what I mean by that is this housekeeper wave that I talked about, that's part of your upper gut motility, is made up of these tiny fibers called vinculin. And they are part of this neurological system that clears the upper gut. When the body makes anti-CDTB antibodies, they actually look a lot like vinculin. And so it accidentally attacks this very fiber that's part of the infrastructure of this migrating motor complex. And so now, in essence, you're unable to clear the bacteria, not the food poisoning bacteria now, let's say that case has come and gone, but over the months after you cleared that, you're making these antibodies and you're damaging this migrating motor complex, and now you're unable to clear normal bacteria and they build up. And that's a really common cause of SIBO. And that requires not different antimicrobials, but a different relapse prevention plan than some of these other conditions.
Wow, that's incredible. That's a lot of, like I said, a lot of stuff I haven't heard about. And I've definitely got clients who have had food poisoning and taken some time away from training, then come back and then later on reported, having gut issues, experiencing bloating, and sort of being able to link it back to food poisoning and say, I think something happened there, but really not being able to put their finger on it and specifically point at something like SIBO. So it's fascinating.
That is a really red flag for SIBO. Yeah. And again, people can download this What Caused My SIBO questionnaire at thesibodoctor.com. And it gives you, just like I said, a little bit of a starting point to start to unravel this condition or the cause of your condition, because otherwise, if it was just about bacteria, this would not be a conversation we'd be having, because it's easy to treat bacteria. Let's face it. We have either herbs or we have antibacterials like antibiotics, and they work for this condition. But if you're not treating the underlying cause, you're just on a merry-go-round of treating bacteria that are just never really allowed to completely resolve.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's a good advice and good idea with the questionnaire. I think that could be a real eye-opener for a lot of people, just to sit down and do that and see if it points towards that. You mentioned before testing and doing like the breath test, but you've also mentioned that there are different types of SIBO. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe how the test can point us in the direction of the type of SIBO we have?
Yeah. So when you have SIBO, you have bacteria that are producing hydrogen, right? And hydrogen is not really produced by humans. And so when we capture it on a breath test, because it's exhaled, it's absorbed through the gut. When bacteria produce it, it's absorbed, and then it's exhaled on the breath, and we can capture that and measure it and determine if you have SIBO. So hydrogen is sort of the basic building block, right? The gas. If you have hydrogen SIBO, that's your classic SIBO. If you've got a ton of hydrogen in the first 80 minutes, 90 minutes, you're pretty sure to have SIBO. There is another gas that has used hydrogen in order to make methane, right? So you have other organisms that are old, ancient organisms, not really bacteria. They're called archaea, and they're arguably some of the oldest creatures on the planet. They are, known as thermatophiles or thermophiles, and they live at like sulfur vents at the bottom of the ocean, and they live in biofilm, and they live in extreme conditions. So they also live inside you. A little bit is normal because it actually can concentrate gas in your gut, but overproduction of methane is associated with constipation. So we're in the process of really thinking of that type of SIBO as a different condition, and not really SIBO, because it's not really a bacteria, and it doesn't have that damage to the motility, and it has different types of risk factors. So, and then the third type of gas, so you have hydrogen, you have methane, and thirdly is hydrogen sulfide, which also requires hydrogen to be produced. And those are different organisms that produce that. And it's very difficult to actually get an accurate test for that, because there's only one lab in the entire world that has developed a breath test sensitive enough to pick up hydrogen sulfide. But whenever there's just one lab, I'm like waiting until all the beta testing it and on all the patients, and until we actually have solid science that we can put in other labs and use their testing. But those are the three types of SIBO that you can have. Hydrogen type of SIBO, which is very common, that can cause either diarrhea or a mixed pattern. Then we have what we call IMO, or intestinal methanogen overgrowth, which is your methane type, and that's more constipation related. And then we have hydrogen sulfide. When hydrogen sulfide is present, it usually causes diarrhea if it's present in the small intestine. But it also has other symptoms. People have a lot of burning symptoms, sensitivity to alcohol, and lots of other sort of extra digestive symptoms that could potentially lead somebody to kind of think that patient might have hydrogen sulfide. But again, it's difficult to test for that.
Okay, yeah, 100%. And not all SIBO is equal. You've given us this idea of these different types. I'm assuming that the treatment plan or the process that you go through, depending on the test results, is going to be very different.
Yes. So, I mean, in terms of herbal antimicrobials, there are some similarities, right? Mm-hmm. So we know that, the most common, let's start with conventional antibiotics. The most conventional antibiotic that's used is called Xifaxan or rifaximin. It's a very specific type of antibiotic that is more or less microbiome sparing. So we really like that. It stays in the small intestine and it's really effective for the treatment of SIBO. As a naturopath, obviously, we like herbs and we like things like oregano oil and substances we've used for many, many thousands of years to treat anything from any kind of bacterial infection. Herbs have definitely predated antibiotics. And because it is more sparing also on the microbiome, we also prefer that. But it usually means that if you use herbs, you're treating it for a little bit longer than, let's say, antibiotics.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. What happens if SIBO goes untreated? Do we know like the long-term implications of something of SIBO if like a patient just doesn't know they've had it, they've been told to eat more fiber and, do X, Y, and Z from their normal doctor? What are long-term impacts?
Well, besides just being super miserable, right? And ongoing SIBO, what can happen is, as I mentioned, the bacteria ferment the food, which then produce gas. And that gas is really damaging to what's called the brush border. And the brush border is kind of, if you think about your small intestine like a rolled up shaggy carpet, it's kind of like the little fingers that are protruding in. That's basically your villi. And the villi, on top of the villi are little tiny hairs called the microvilli, which is your brush border. And in this brush border, you produce really critical enzymes that do the last step of absorption. And these brush border enzymes are different from pancreatic enzymes and other enzymes you can take supplementally. There are some companies that make them now that are really also very successful. So you can have nutritional malabsorption can definitely be a risk factor of SIBO. Another issue can be fatigue. Can be a lot of what we call extra digestive symptoms with anxiety, with depression. You can have real mood issues associated with irritable bowel syndrome and SIBO, partially because of these nutritional deficiency and also the inflammation that results from SIBO, but also when you have IBS and you're dealing with these digestive issues that can be a real dampener on your mood for sure. It can disrupt your sleep. It can disrupt your recovery from exercise. There's a lot there that it affects. So that's why people talk about it, because if it was just bloating, I think a lot of people would put up with it, right? But there are all these other issues that make life really not fun. So I could go on and on because there's so many associated conditions also with SIBO. You have more of a risk factor for gallstones and for fibromyalgia and burning bladder syndrome, and lots of different things can happen when you have SIBO.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? I suppose it just comes back to that sort of gut connection, isn't it? The gut's connected to every other system in our body. And if there's something going on in the gut that's causing inflammation, digestive issues, malabsorption, all those things that you're sort of talking about, like the downstream impacts are just crazy. And I suppose we can't really say that it's going to cause X, Y, and Z autoimmune disease, but we can sort of think about, if the gut's not working properly, it's going to put us at a higher risk for all of these things happening, especially over long term for sure.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, there's ample evidence, and so in some way, SIBO is a dysbiosis of your microbiome, right? It's an imbalance of a particular microbiome in a particular location. The other thing that happens when you have this imbalance is and the way it increases inflammation. And we know inflammation increases your risk factor for cardiovascular disease and mood disorders and diabetes even, and things like that. So, or metabolic syndrome is the two main bacteria that produce hydrogen and that are causative for SIBO are E. coli and Klebsiella. So it's a different E. coli than the one that caused the food poisoning, because you have normal E. coli in your gut. But when they overgrow in the small intestine, they also produce something called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. And that's a substance in the cell wall of these bacteria that is one of the most potent inflammatory substances that we know. So when you have leaky gut and you have this SIBO situation, you're actually just absorbing this LPS substance that then continually triggers inflammation in your body. So it's real. It's a real issue. And I think a real sort of hidden condition that a lot of people don't consider in terms of inflammatory diseases.
Yeah, incredible. It just sounds like it can cause so much damage. Like we just think about, okay, it's a small intestine bacterial overgrowth, but what you've just sort of said, it's just like it can have such a big impact on so many systems in the body. And I suppose the longer you leave it, like the more it can cause, more and more damage.
Yeah, but it's not like IBD, right? IBD is inflammatory bowel disease, which is a real serious disorder that many people lose portions of their colon over this. And that's Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. So it's a totally different category, less dramatic, and people can go for years, 40, 50s. I've seen people that have lived with it for 40, 50 years. And yeah, it was suboptimal, but they're still alive and they're still living. So and now what we know is so much more than when I first started out, right? So I think there's real hope on the horizon for a lot of people to really get on top of their SIBO. But that's, like I said, my mission is to educate practitioners, because just like you, there's a lot of people that really don't understand all of the implication and the breadth of issues that are associated with SIBO.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I've been working in health and fitness since about 2010. I would say, for majority of my career in health and fitness, I've talked to clients about gut issues or heard about their gut issues, but not been able to help them. Obviously, it's not my scope of practice, but the more I've learned or the more I've worked with other colleagues that have those expertise and learn about it, well, then I can point clients in the right direction or give them, the contacts that they can speak to that are going to better help them with that. And I think the more awareness we have about, these sort of conditions, then we can obviously point.
But see, this is where the interesting thing where we see, because a lot of people, when I'm on a sabbatical right now, but when I see patients that are like, have failed treatment, right? So I see the worst of the worst. And a lot of people tried a lot of the gut sort of healing approaches of doing more fermented foods and doing more prebiotics. And that's like the worst thing you can do for SIBO, right? Because you're feeding the bacteria and you're adding to your histamine pool with the fermented foods, which is already high because of SIBO. So if you're getting worse with that advice, that might actually be a clue for you, And so this is why I've also done a course for patients, the SIBO Success Plan, because I got so many emails from people all over the world that couldn't find a SIBO practitioner. And then I've also done another course that's about microbiome restoration and really understanding what you're trying to accomplish based on your own stool profile, because we've got some good testing options here in Australia. So that's something else, is to really actually not just across the board, everybody drink kombucha. That's like, I think we got to have a little more finesse than that. And also probiotics, there's like a time and a place for that.
Yeah, 100%. I think that circles back to the social media stuff you're sort of saying before. There's a lot of advice out there about, hey, this is really good for your gut health. Eat more sauerkraut, have more kombucha, do all these sort of things. And like you say, putting that fermented food in there and that bacteria can just make you even more bloated. I think that's probably a good sign that something's going wrong if you have some of that stuff and it causes that bloating. I like now we're sort of heading towards like treatment and talking about treatment. Where do we start? Like if you've got someone that's tested positive with SIBO, what's the first point of call?
So back when I first started out with SIBO, so this is 13 years ago, I was just sort of like, the one thing I always hate is when patients came to me and I had to I was forced to give them 10, 12 products for their different things. So I was just like, no, I'm actually going to structure this in a different way. And I created a resource called the biphasic diet, which is, as the name implies, is structured so that the first part, which is phase 1, is quite strict in terms of low FODMAP, no grains, and really reducing the inflammation of the gut and also supporting the digestive tract. And the reason for that was I had a patient in my office. I gave them a test kit. I said, go home and do this test kit. And until we get the test result back, you go on phase 1 of the diet. Almost, well, not always, but many times people would come back and say, wow, I feel already so much better, right? Mm-hmm. And then their test was positive. We would go on to phase 2, which then we started to incorporate antimicrobials. And that approach, I had that diet out. It was a free resource, and it tens of thousands of times has been downloaded and suggested by practitioners. So we know it's a really good strategy. So that's step 1, is to actually get on top of the inflammation by reducing the fuel for the bacteria, which is a low FODMAP diet. But the biphasic diet is more than just low FODMAP. It's also specific carbohydrate combined. And then you start with antimicrobials, and you might do that if it's herbal. You might do that for 6 weeks. I'm a big believer in retesting and understanding whether or not you've really cleared SIBO, and that it has I had to accept that that's really the best way to do it, because many times patients came to me, had a diagnosis of SIBO, had been on a treatment protocol, and were not improving, came to me, I retested them, and they were clear. It was something else that was causing their symptoms at that time. So that's something else to consider, but that's more advanced. So basically, antimicrobials, digestive support, anti-inflammatories, reducing the fuel for the bacteria. Then afterwards, depending on what category of underlying causes you fell into, if you had something going on with your motility, which is the biggest category, could be, like I said, hypothyroid, it could be mold, it could be infections, it could be that you had this food poisoning previously. At that point, we initiate something called prokinetics, which is a substance that aims to reset the normal motility of the small intestine, and their prescription and also herbal remedies for that. So all of that is also outlined in the SIBO success plan, because people need to know what they're actually doing and kind of help to identify what's going on for them.
Yeah.
And, so typically a SIBO treatment protocol is about 3 months.
Wow. Yeah. And what sort of success rate do you have with that sort of protocol?
If it's simple SIBO, I'd say close to 100%, right? If it's complicated, which most of my patients bear in mind, they've got mold, they got NCAS, they've got lots of different things going on. It's a process. The SIBO part might be okay, but we got all this other stuff to do, and that can be a year or so. Yeah.
You also mentioned there like carbohydrates. Can you talk a little bit more about what is it about the carbohydrates that cause, or what we want to remove them for the diet? Why is it the carbohydrates that make SIBO worse?
It's not all carbohydrates. There's lots of carbohydrates that are allowed on this diet, like potato and white rice and stuff. It's certain prebiotic fibers, foods that are rich in prebiotics. So it's based on what's called low FODMAP, right? And FODMAP has been discovered by Monash University, which we owe a debt of gratitude to Monash, because this was a huge step in this whole IBS and SIBO journey. But FODMAP is fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, which are all substances that constitute some sort of what we call prebiotic. And a prebiotic is a substance that preferentially feeds bacteria. So they're fabulous for your health when the bacteria are in the right location, but they're disastrous when they're feeding bacteria in the small intestine where they can overgrow.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's like a lot of diets we're told, or a lot of foods we're told, these are really good foods for you. And, we mentioned sauerkraut, and we mentioned, different prebiotics and different foods that can be really, really healthy, but it depends on the health of your gut, and it depends on the individual. There are times where, I think the saying is, one man's food can be another man's poison.
Yes. But it's generally those foods. I'm a big fan of FODMAP foods, right? There is a time and a place for that. Once you cleared SIBO, you do want to kind of promote a healthy microbiome in your large intestine. And we want to strive to get there, to actually have a high FODMAP food or high fiber food, and go for like the 40, 50 vegetable, different types of plant-based foods that we know is so fabulous for the microbiome, 40, 50 plant-based foods per week and all of that.
Yep. Do proteins and fats that we know of cause any issues with like the SIBO and what's going on there?
So if somebody has digestion that's really pretty good, so enough stomach acid, enough bile, and enough enzymes, pancreatic enzymes, those foods are great. They don't actually cause any problem with SIBO. But the problem is if you have, let's say you have a hydrogen sulfide overgrowth, which is caused by different bacteria that cause the hydrogen SIBO. Hydrogen sulfide really likes high fat diets and high protein diets. And if you have a high protein diet, that tends to increase the absorption of this inflammatory substance. So I'm not a huge fan of the carnivore diet for that reason. And if somebody gets real benefit of that, to me, that's more of an indication that they potentially have SIBO, right? Because they're removing all carbs, which shouldn't be necessary. But if you get really a dramatic response to no carbs at all, then for sure you've got some bacterial imbalance, or very likely that you have a bacterial imbalance that's causing, that imbalance is driving a lot of inflammation for you. And if you don't feed them and the inflammation goes down and you're feeling better, I would just be curious about that rather than thinking you have to just be on that for the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting to wonder how many of the carnivore crowd have had that experience and then switched to carnivore and felt, I feel amazing. Now this is the diet that everybody should be eating because it makes me feel so great.
Exactly. There is no one diet that, for me, it's, if anything, it's the blue zone diet, right? It's the diet that is predominantly plant-based and, what we know, where people live to be over 100 years old. To me, that's evidence-based.
Okay. Yeah. With that diet and like removing those FODMAPs, how strict do people have to be? If people start sneaking some of that in, is that going to have a big impact on their ability to cure something like SIBO?
It really depends, case by case. Some people can get away with quite a bit while they're on antimicrobials. And there's argument of that's not such a bad thing to actually feed them a little bit while you're killing them, right? If you can tolerate them. But some people can't tolerate that. As soon as they start eating prebiotics and FODMAPs, they become symptomatic. Now, I'm not saying they should stay on that low FODMAP diet. I'm not a fan of that either, because you want to just reestablish balance in these different microbiomes so that you can eventually go and feed them and, increase all of their wonderful production of health promoting substances like butyrate and so forth.
Yeah, 100%. What sort of transformation are people having with this? So your client's coming to you feeling bloated, feeling fatigued, feeling tired, and then doing, let's say it's that reset with the diet and then the protocol for 3 months. How can you describe that sort of transformation that they have?
Again, I have people that have been sick for a long time, have lots of different issues. And some people are really easy, and within 3 months they're, waving the happy flag and singing my praises. So that type of thing is wonderful to witness, but also taking more charge of their nervous system in their gut in general, which means working with the autonomic nervous system and this, and basically sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system outputs, which is so prevalent. And a lot of people that have got issues, it's like this dominance of sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight, right? Which means digestion stops. So there's a lot of different levels. And that to me sparks the most joy, is when somebody has learned a lot and knows how to take, is a better steward of their own microbiome and their own gut health, and very individualized, and has a lot of insights into what foods they can tolerate and things like that. And that to me is wonderful when I'm no longer needed.
Yeah, incredible. It's great when they build that awareness, isn't it? That's like going through such a big journey to really find out more about themselves and being able to take that information forward. I'm glad you brought up the nervous system stuff, because I've heard before like, that with SIBO, it can be sort of stress related, and people under a lot of stress maybe can have this impact on their gut that might lead to SIBO. Can you speak a little bit about more how maybe stress affects our gut health and maybe how that links into SIBO?
So if you think about, there was actually a great book written, I can't remember the author now, it'll come to me, I think it's Sidney Baker, but it was called The Second Brain, right? There are lots of great gut books, but this one really explains the fact that the gut is really independent of your central nervous system in a way. You have, it's so intricate to survival that it needs to really rely on its own neurological system. But you have what's called the gut-brain connection, right? Which is the this sort of highway of information that leads up to the brain and informs the brain what's going on with the gut and if there's inflammation and intruders and this and that. So there's a big connection between the gut and the brain. When you're stressed, you are basically in this autonomic nervous system predominance called sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight. And when the fight or flight is activated, this also triggers this old reptilian part of your brain called the amygdala. And if it's going on long enough, you can set up this chronic condition of being in fight or flight for a very long time, which is never meant to be. You're meant to run from the threat and then recover, just like animals. You see a zebra getting away from a lion. It doesn't just have a nervous breakdown. It shakes itself off and it goes back to grazing. And we don't really do that. We have this prolonged stress, which is a real strain on the cranial nerve called the vagus nerve. And you've probably heard of the vagus nerve. You've got two of them coming out of the brainstem and coming down and kind of innervating parts of your digestive tract. It's crucial for different digestive function. The vagus nerve is mostly active in parasympathetic. It's called rest and digest for a reason, right? So if you never really get to that, you can have serious implications on how well you're digesting your food, and this issue of poor digestive juice output. So less stomach acid, less bile, like all these different things can be also affected. So that's one thing. The other thing is that you have this brain in your gut, and central to that is something called the myenteric plexus. And that can also be very much associated with the motility of your small intestine. And when you're chronically in fight or flight, that can also be affected. So in a way, yes, very high chronic stress. A lot of people say, I went through hell in my divorce. And since then I've had IBS. And so clearly I will go down this road. And a great thing for those patients is gut-centered hypnotherapy, which is actually, you wouldn't think it works as well as it does, but it works really well for really calming that brain in your gut down. So
wow, I can't say I've ever heard of it. What is that?
There's a couple of clinics. I think one is in Melbourne and one is in Sydney. It's called the Gut Clinic. And it's basically gut-centered hypnotherapy is really kind of getting patients in a relaxed state and then visualizing and really relaxing different parts very consciously. And if you look at the research, it has very good results with IBS and also SIBO in terms of symptom control.
Wow, fascinating. Very, very interesting. A lot of like weekend warriors in terms of, sport and athletics, and even like some elite athletes that I've worked with report a lot of gut issues, having trouble with their stool, constant diarrhea, lots of things going on with that, poor quality sleep, all these things that sort of tie into what you're talking about here. And they're exposing themselves generally to high volumes of training or high volumes of exercise, which is like they're applying all that, physical stress on their body and not allowing enough time for that parasympathetic rest, digest, and recovery. And it's not something that happens quickly. Like, they could start training and be fine for the first 6 months, 8 months or whatever. But over time, if they keep that volume really, really high, it starts to accumulate and it really starts to have negative impacts.
Absolutely. And, you're familiar with this concept of leaky gut, right? And there's some argument whether or not it exists. It's known as intestinal permeability in the literature. So yes, it definitely does exist. And it's when your digestive surface, so this shaggy carpet, becomes too porous and allows undigested foods, but also bacterial toxins to be absorbed, which I mentioned is a big trigger for inflammation. And the number one, how they induce, or maybe not induce, but the people that have the most leaky gut are marathon runners right after the marathon, right? And there's argument that there's some thought that it becomes leaky because you need so much fuel so quickly, right? But it's like the floodgates are open. So over exercise, if you have gut issues and you notice that they're getting worse with that, that's something to really investigate with this.
It's funny you mentioned that, because that's exactly what led me into learning more about gut health. So I used to be a triathlete and did a lot of training, and my gut health just went south, and I really noticed it. And that's where I first started looking at, okay, food sensitivities, is that causing my problem? Because I knew the eggs were causing me to feel sick, and there were certain foods that I was eating and I just couldn't put my finger on it. And that's when I started doing more tests and reaching out to functional medicine doctors and integrated medicine doctors. And that's really what opened my world to like gut health and how important it is. So
yeah,
nice
great.
To,
get an answer as to why that happens. Yeah. It's how they do research on intestinal permeability in humans is just study marathon runners.
I used to think they were the healthiest people in the world. I put them up there, wow, these guys are so fit, they're so healthy. Yeah. But then after competing in the sport, but also watching the professional sport, like so many of them have gut issues, and it's just like,
it's interesting. Well, also partially is because they have a kind of crazy eating. They do a lot of protein. And then if you're constantly in a sympathetic nervous system overdrive, as I just mentioned, and you can't digest well because your vagus is turned off and you're just dumping tons of protein, it might not be fermented into hydrogen, but you're not digesting it very well. And that itself, like you can have tons of other issues besides SIBO when you have, high stress.
Yeah. If you are a high stress person, or if you're a triathlete or whatever you're doing, is there certain things that you could recommend that they should be thinking about or including that might help them mitigate some of that? Or... Yeah,
simple for I was a marathon runner for a while when I was back in Montana. And glutamine is a really good substance. So glutamine is pretty cheap, glutamine powder, and it's the most abundant amino acid. You get it in your food, but it is used by the intestinal cells to regenerate. And so just adding a couple of scoops of probably 5-10 grams of glutamine to your protein shake, might be something. I'm not your doctor, so I don't know the situation, but this is a simple thing that might help. But it's really looking more at the balance, right? We're wanting more balance in diet, in rest and recovery, and those kinds of things. I think the kind of real hardcore training, I think we know too much now, don't we, in terms of the stress that the physical exertion has on our body and recovery. So I would say just also work with balance, work with meditation, work with rest and recovery besides just products, and then don't overdo it with protein. We know you can be an elite athlete with far less protein, as was preached, for decades.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing you make. I found with glutamine myself that when I took it, if I took it in a big dosage, like 5 to 10 grams, and was like, okay, take that down, it just went straight through me. And I found that the best way to take glutamine for me at the time, when I definitely was having leaky gut, was to put it in a bottle and just sip it throughout the day as steady intake, not too much.
Yeah, it's an unusual reaction to glutamine. So I'd say glutamine is probably one of the most safest substances we know. And the dosage that's in the literature for leaky gut is far more than higher than a lot of these kind of soothing powders that are out there.
Yeah.
So, and again, this was just a very simple single recommendation. And certainly, always talk to your doctor and all the rest of it.
Yeah. You've touched a bit, or you've brought up a couple of times, like stomach acid and digestive enzymes, and stomach acid sort of being low. Are there particular symptoms that we can have that might suggest that our stomach acid is low? And if it is low, what should we potentially be doing for that?
So stomach acid is, your stomach is supposed to be the acidity of carbohydrate acid in between meals. It goes down, your alkalinity goes up pretty quickly once you eat. But it's really connected to this whole issue of rest and digest, right? So we start digestion by actually smelling food or thinking about food. Our body starts to kind of get ready for the food by producing stomach acid. A lot of people have no problem with stomach acid, right? I'm not saying everybody now needs to do this, but if you're somebody if you eat a high protein meal and you just feel really full and really just kind of, it sits there forever, that's to me the biggest clue, or get really sort of fatigued after high protein. That's me, right? I have more of a low stomach acid, just genetically low stomach acid output. And so what I do, and what a lot of my patients do, is we start with like bitter herbs that stimulate your own production of stomach acid. And there are plenty of good formulas out there. And then you kind of can increase you can go to HCl, for example. And some people find great relief with that. But I would say my favorite really is working with the herbs, because they work on your own machinery of producing stomach acid. And just a word about H. pylori. So H. pylori is the bacteria that lives in your stomach and can survive stomach acid. But if you've had H. pylori, you've had basically a bacteria that destroyed the cells that are producing stomach acid. So a lot of people after treatment do need some support in the form of HCl, for example. So if you're somebody who's eating tons of protein for, weight training and all of that, and you can't stomach it, you're feeling really heavy and tired, that may be part of the picture.
Yeah, that's sound advice, because I definitely know a few people that have had H. pylori and then they've had trouble before eating protein fine, but then afterwards just feeling, I suppose, again, that bloated or that sluggish, like I'm so full, I can't digest it properly. So that's sound advice there. Really, really, we'll be using that with a few clients as well. Is there anything else that you think that we need to cover around sort of SIBO that we haven't sort of touched on that you think listeners might gain benefit from?
I think I think it's pretty well covered. I mean, it's a really broad topic, so I could really veer off into any direction here. But the main thing is it's a treatable condition. It can be tested for. It's a really uninvasive test that you can do at home. It just takes an overnight fast, and you can measure your breath samples every 20 minutes for 3 hours. You send it to the lab, and within a few days we know whether or not you have SIBO, and then you can take steps to correct that. So it just feels like, it's, whereas IBS was always this nebulous sort of term that and condition and diagnosis you were given, you can really do some amazing work on your own to help yourself in this regard. But if it's not working, then I really recommend that you go with somebody who has a lot of SIBO treating experience, a practitioner. And we do have a database on our website, on SIBOtest.com, where we can search a database for SIBO savvy practitioners. So that's also a good resource.
Yeah, awesome. One question that does pop to mind is like reoccurrence. If I've had SIBO, am I in a higher bracket to potentially have it again, or what's the likelihood of me?
Depends on your underlying cause. Yeah. So, for example, the scenario of the food poisoning that a few months later caused this, you have 6 times more at risk for having another bout of food poisoning, right? Oh. So you're just more at risk for food poisoning if you've had if you have SIBO from that. So not just SIBO relapse is also quite common if the prokinetic isn't working or practitioner didn't give you a prokinetic after treatment, then relapse can be really quickly, But if you just have SIBO because of digestive deficits and you keep up with your digestive support, you can keep SIBO at bay.
Yeah, interesting. Greatly appreciate your time, Nirala. It's been awesome to connect and it's been awesome to learn a lot. I've learned a lot just from this conversation, and there's definitely some useful tips I'll be sharing with a lot of my clients around this. If people want to follow you, if people want to learn more about what you do, where's the best place they can do that?
So I'm not in practice right now.
Yeah.
But I'm on a sabbatical. But the website that has all the information and the free resources and my podcast and all of that is thesibodoctor.com. And you can do courses, you can do questionnaires, you have just a lot of information there. So I think that's the best. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, and there are different groups that you can join if you think you are, if you are SIBO positive. We have like the SIBO lifestyle group that has, I think, 20,000 members now. So there's a lot of support there as well for people.
Wow. Incredible. Love your work. Thank you very much for your time. Greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks for tuning in to the Midlife Mavericks podcast. Remember, your journey to optimal health and vitality doesn't end here. You're just getting started. Keep embracing the mindset of a maverick. Stay committed to your visions, values, and goals. Continue taking meaningful steps towards a life filled with energy, purpose, and fulfillment. Until next time, keep thriving and living life on your own terms.